The flash of light under the desert sun wasn't a mirage. It was the face of a woman buried alive. And when John Herrera chose to dig her out, he set events in motion that would change his life forever. But before that moment, the desert was just another battlefield, silent, merciless, and waiting. The desert burned like an endless furnace. John Herrera guided his aging Mustang, Dusty, along a dried riverbed, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of pale dust. The sun hammered down, baking the earth into cracked plates. Every breath John drew felt like swallowing fire. He wasn't scouting for anything in particular, just riding, as he often did, through the wasteland that had become his home. The wind tugged at his worn hat and rattled the bones of old mesquite trees. Somewhere far behind him, the borderland slept under the same cruel sky. But John had long stopped thinking of home. Home was gone, burned away 3 years ago when the Federales stormed his village. He remembered the smoke, the screams, the last time he saw Elena holding their twin children, Miguel and Carmen. By the time John reached them, it was too late. All he could do was bury what was left and walk away from the revolution, from Pancho Villa's riders, from everything. Now the only family he had was Dusty, a battered Winchester rifle, and a weathered Bible with Elena's handwriting tucked between its pages. Each night he lit a small lantern, kneeled by a crude wooden cross carved by his father, and whispered the same prayer. "Lord, forgive me, for I failed them." But today, something in the wind felt different. Dusty stopped abruptly, ears twitching. John squinted at a glint of sunlight reflecting off something half buried in the sand dunes ahead. He nudged the horse forward, his hand hovering near the rifle. At first he thought it was a trick of the heat haze. Then he saw it, a face. His breath caught. A woman's head jutted out from a mound of hardened earth. She was buried alive, neck deep, under the relentless sun. Her black hair tangled in the hot wind, her skin blistered and raw. Her lips were split and bloodied, yet her eyes, dark as oil, burned with a strange defiance. John muttered under his breath, "Damn." He scanned the horizon, half expecting a trap, but there was nothing. Silence, broken only by the whisper of sand. He remembered an old superstition. An Apache woman buried alive carries a curse. Whoever digs her out inherits her doom. John had no reason to care, not anymore. He pulled at the reins. Not my fight, he told himself. He could just ride on, pretend he never saw her. Then the sun caught a flash of silver on her wrist, a bracelet, simple but familiar. It looked like Elena's, the one she wore the day she died. John cursed under his breath, swung off Dusty, and dropped to his knees. His fingers tore at the packed earth, nails breaking as he clawed the sand. The woman's breath was shallow, almost gone. At last he freed her. She collapsed against him like a rag doll. He uncapped his canteen, just a few drops left, and poured them over her cracked lips. For the first time in years, John felt something stir in his soul. Maybe God wasn't done with him yet. John lifted the frail woman onto Dusty's saddle. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling even when unconscious. He climbed up behind her, his arms steadying her as he turned the Mustang toward the canyon. The ride was silent, except for the sound of hooves on the dry ground. "Easy, boy, just a little further," John muttered to his horse. By the time they reached the narrow ravine, night had started to fall. The rebel camp came into view, 2 fires burning low, rifles stacked against a wagon, and a circle of 20 rough-faced men and women making last-minute preparations for tomorrow's raid on the Federal train. When John rode in, conversation stopped. Faces turned. Eyes locked on the Apache woman slumped against his chest. A few hands dropped to revolvers. Esperanza Vega, the camp's captain, stepped forward. Her green eyes were sharp as cut glass. She let her Winchester rest casually in her hands, but her stance radiated tension. "What the hell are you doing, Herrera? Who is that woman?" she demanded. John slid off Dusty, careful not to let the woman fall. "Found her buried alive," he said, voice steady but tired. "I couldn't leave her out there to die." Esperanza frowned. "Buried alive? That's Apache business. You know their ways. It could be a trap." "She's half dead, Esperanza. I'm not leaving her to the buzzards," John answered firmly. A few men muttered, shifting uneasily. In wartime, a stranger was as dangerous as a bullet. John laid the woman on a bedroll near the fire. She opened her eyes, dark, burning with fever, and scanned every face like a wounded animal gauging danger. Two small figures stepped out from behind a stack of saddles. Rosie, 8 years old, clutched a rag doll with torn seams. Pete, 6, with big brown eyes, stood just behind her. The woman's gaze softened. She lifted a trembling hand toward Rosie, brushing the child's tangled hair. Her voice came as a whisper, soft and raw. "Beautiful." The words silenced the murmurs. Rosie's lips curled into a shy smile. Pete crept closer, curiosity winning over fear. John knelt by the fire, pulling out his tin pot. He brewed cinnamon-spiced coffee, the same way Elena had done every winter morning. The warm scent filled the air, cutting through the tension like a memory. He poured a little into a battered tin cup and offered it to the woman. Her hands shook, but she gripped it tight, as if it were the first real warmth she had felt in weeks. She sipped slowly, her black eyes never leaving his. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled. The desert wind howled in the distance. And for the first time in years, John felt something stir deep in his chest, an ember of life he thought had burned out long ago. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. Dawn bled over the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of amber and fire. John Herrera stood beside the dying embers of the campfire, sipping bitter coffee from a dented tin cup. The Apache woman, Ahyona, was awake now, sitting cross-legged on a blanket near the edge of the fire. Her black hair hung loose, still dusted with sand, and her sharp eyes followed every movement in the camp. Esperanza Vega, the camp's captain, appeared from the shadows of a wagon. She had a way of moving that made people step aside, even without her rifle in hand. Her green eyes locked on John with a glare sharp enough to cut through steel. "She leaves after tomorrow's raid," Esperanza said flatly. "We can't carry dead weight, especially not someone we can't trust." John didn't look at her right away. He stared into his coffee, then glanced at Ahyona, who was quietly braiding Rosie's hair. "She's not dead weight," he said. "She saved those kids last night. They were crying for water, and she kept them calm. That counts for something." Esperanza crossed her arms, unimpressed. "You know what Apache trackers are like. They'd sell their own blood for a handful of bullets. If the Federales find out we're harboring one of them, it's not just her neck on the line. It's all of ours." John's voice hardened. "She's not our enemy. Not yet." That last part made Esperanza's eyebrow twitch. "Not yet. Sounds like you're betting all of our lives on a stranger. You sure about that?" John turned to face her fully. "You think I don't know what risk looks like? I've lived with it every damn day since Elena and the kids were taken from me. But this woman, I don't see a spy when I look at her. I see someone who's barely holding on, someone who's been through hell, same as us." For a moment, Esperanza said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the children. Rosie giggled as Ahyona tied a string of tiny beads into her braid. Pete was showing Ahyona a smooth stone he'd found, his face lighting up with each nod of approval she gave. Esperanza sighed, a rare crack in her tough demeanor. She leaves after the raid, that's final. Until then, she stays under your watch. If she so much as sneezes wrong, I'll put her down myself. John gave a slow nod. He didn't like it, but that was as much as he'd get from Esperanza for now. As the morning sun climbed higher, Ahyona finished Rosie's braid and turned to Pete. From a pouch tied around her waist, she pulled a small green stone, polished and etched with faint markings. She whispered something in Apache, her tone soft and melodic, before handing it to the boy. He held it with both hands, as though it were something sacred. John watched them from across the camp. The tenderness in Ahyona's gestures stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt since Elena's gentle touch on their children's hair. For a fleeting second, he wondered if this broken woman was a sign from God, a reminder that even in the heart of war, there could still be grace. The sun was high by the time John found Ahyona sitting alone on a boulder near the canyon wall. Rosie and Pete were napping in the shade of the supply wagon, and the rest of the camp was busy sharpening knives, checking rifle sights, and preparing for the raid. Ahyona sat with her knees drawn up, her head bowed as though listening to the whispers of the wind. She was turning something in her hand, a small green stone, smooth as river glass. John approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "That stone," he said, breaking the silence. "I've seen markings like that before. What is it?" She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a moment she didn't answer. Then, in halting Spanish mixed with a few English words, she said, "Sacred. My people, they guard water, trails, old trails." She traced a line on the stone with her fingertip, mimicking the shape of winding canyons. "This shows the way." John crouched beside her. "So that's why you were buried?" Ahyona nodded, her face unreadable. She tapped her chest lightly, then shook her head. "No children," she said softly. "My tribe, they say a woman who cannot give life brings death. I am cast out." John felt a pang in his chest. He thought of Elena, of how she used to sing to Miguel and Carmen while stirring the beans on their little stove. He thought of the day the federales came, how they took everything, how he had failed to protect them. He swallowed hard. "They buried you for that? For something you can't change?" Ahyona's lips tightened. "Apache law, old and cruel. But not all are bad. My brother, he believes I am curse. He is warrior, strong. He will hunt me." John's brows furrowed. "Your brother? He's out there now?" Ahyona nodded, holding the green stone close to her chest, as if it were both shield and wound. John rubbed his jaw, his mind racing. If what she said was true, the federales weren't the only threat. Apache trackers could navigate the desert better than any soldier. That stone, federales would kill to get it. It leads to water, doesn't it? Ahyona's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she held the stone up to the sunlight, letting the green surface glint. "Water, life," she said at last. "But in wrong hands, death." John leaned back on his heels, looking at her with new understanding. By saving her, he hadn't just rescued a woman. He had stumbled into something far bigger. Her knowledge of the desert, her sacred map, could change the tide for anyone who held it. That meant bounty hunters, federales, maybe even his own rebel allies would come looking. He sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "You know, you've brought a storm with you," he muttered. Ahyona tilted her head, as though trying to understand the words. After a pause, she replied softly, "Storm follows me always." John stood, extending a hand to help her up. She hesitated, then took it. "If we're in this storm," he said quietly, "we'll face it together." Ayana's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. For the first time, John saw something shift in her expression, a fragile trust, like a seed just beginning to sprout. The next morning came heavy with tension. The canyon camp was alive with movement. Rifles were loaded, dynamite sticks checked, and horses saddled. The plan was simple: ambush a federal supply train carrying weapons and ammunition. But plans had a way of turning to dust in this desert. John adjusted the strap of his Winchester and looked over at Ahyona. She sat with Rosie and Pete, showing them how to twist thin strips of leather into braids, her hands steady despite the anxiety that hummed through the camp. "You stay close to the fire, you hear?" John said, crouching in front of her. He spoke slowly, knowing her English was limited. "Kids, safe, here." He gestured to Rosie and Pete, making she understood. Ahyona nodded once, her expression serious. She pointed to the children, then to her own chest. "With me," she said. John allowed himself a faint smile. "Good." Esperanza strode by, her green eyes glinting like shards of glass. "Let's move," she called to the riders. "That train's not going to stop itself." By sunrise they were in position. The tracks cut through a rocky pass a mile from camp. John and Esperanza crouched behind a ridge, rifles ready, while two others worked fast to set dynamite under the rails. The air was still, save for the distant hum of steel wheels on iron. John glanced at Esperanza. "You ever think this life will end?" Esperanza smirked without humor. "Not with men like us." Then came the whistle. The train thundered into view, smoke rising from its black engine. Esperanza's signal, one of the rebels yanked the fuse cord. A deafening blast shattered the silence as the front wheels of the engine jumped the track, sending sparks into the air. "Move!" Esperanza shouted. They surged forward, firing into the air as the Federales scrambled out of the cars. Gunfire cracked like thunder. John took cover behind a boulder, sighted down his Winchester, and dropped a soldier who aimed too close to their dynamite stash. The rebels moved with precision, gathering rifles, ammo crates, and sacks of supplies as chaos roared around them. By the time the sun climbed higher, the fight was done. The rebels had the upper hand, and the train was theirs. They loaded the spoils onto their horses and vanished into the desert before reinforcements could arrive. Back at camp, John expected Ahyona to be where he had left her. But what he saw made him stop cold. Rosie sat in front of Ahyona, her hair now neatly braided, tiny beads woven into the strands. Pete knelt nearby, practicing tying small knots with a piece of rope. Ahyona's voice, low and melodic, rose in what sounded like an old Apache lullaby. It was haunting but soothing, a melody that seemed to belong to the desert itself. John stood there watching, his heart tightening in his chest. The scene reminded him of Elena, of the evenings when she would hum to the children as they sat by the fire. For a moment, he was no longer in this war-torn canyon. He was back home, where life had been simple and love had felt eternal. Ahyona looked up and caught him watching. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, small but genuine. Something shifted deep inside John, a feeling he thought had been buried with Elena. Night fell over the canyon, the sky heavy with stars. The rebels sat around the fire, cleaning weapons and counting ammunition after the raid. The victory had been smooth, almost too smooth, and Esperanza's sharp instincts told her something was off. She crouched beside a crate of Mauser cartridges, her brow furrowing. "We're missing 6 rounds," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the hum of campfire chatter. "Who took them?" The men looked at each other but said nothing. Esperanza's gaze snapped to Ahyona, who sat by the children, quietly carving shapes into a piece of wood. Bullets don't just vanish, Esperanza said, standing and pointing a finger. What are you planning, Apache? A hush fell over the camp. John, sitting a few feet away, set down his rifle and rose slowly. Easy, Vega, he said, his voice low. You're barking up the wrong tree. Esperanza took a step forward, her green eyes flashing in the firelight. Wrong tree? Don't tell me you trust her more than your own crew. For all we know, she's feeding information to the Federales. Maybe that raid went too easy for a reason. John's jaw tightened. You know me better than that. I wouldn't bring someone here if I thought she was a danger. Esperanza ignored him, addressing the whole camp now. We're one bad decision away from being wiped out. You all remember Torian, don't you? We can't let a stranger sink us. Before John could argue further, a small voice cut through the tension. She didn't take them, Pete said, stepping out from behind Ahyona. The boy was clutching a folded cloth, his face streaked with dirt and fear. He opened the cloth and revealed 6 freshly cleaned cartridges gleaming under the firelight. The camp went silent. I took them, Pete continued, his voice trembling. Ahyona showed me how to clean bullets. Said a warrior takes care of his ammo like his life. The men exchanged glances, some embarrassed by their quick suspicions. Esperanza stared at the boy, then at Ahyona. Ahyona stood slowly, her posture calm but resolute. She stepped toward Esperanza, her hand reaching for the necklace around her own neck. It was a string of beads and feathers, clearly handmade and ceremonial. She removed it, holding it out with both hands. Her voice, soft and halting in English, carried across the camp. "Sister," she said. Esperanza froze. No one called her that, not since the revolution began. Her eyes flicked to the necklace, then back to Ahyona's dark, steady gaze. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Esperanza reached out and took the necklace. She looked down at it for a long moment before muttering, "We'll see if you've earned that word." John let out a quiet breath of relief. The camp's tension eased, replaced by the crackle of firewood and a faint wind that swept through the canyon. Rosie, oblivious to the grown-up drama, ran to Pete and took one of the polished bullets in her small hand. "Shiny!" she whispered, grinning. Ahyona knelt and brushed Rosie's hair gently, her face calm once more. John watched the scene, his chest tightening again. This woman, once buried in the sand, was slowly earning her place among them. And part of him was afraid of what would happen if they lost her. The next morning broke with a strange stillness. The desert air felt heavier, as if it carried a warning. John was tightening Dusty's saddle when a rider came thundering down the canyon trail, his horse lathered in sweat. "Federales!" the scout shouted, his voice hoarse. "A full column, 30 men, maybe more. They're riding hard, and they're not alone. I saw Apache trackers with them." The camp erupted in low curses and hurried movements. Esperanza strode forward, grabbing the scout by the arm. "How far?" "Half an hour," he panted, "maybe less." John felt his stomach tighten. "Apache trackers," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward Ahyona. She had gone still, her eyes dark and unreadable. She stood, facing the canyon's northern rim. Her voice, quiet but steady, carried over the noise of the camp. "My brother," she said, "Cochise, he will lead them." John turned sharply. "Your brother? You're sure?" Ahyona nodded once, her jaw set. "He wants me dead. He will not stop." Esperanza heard and spat in the sand. "Great, now we're hunted by Federales and a pack of Apaches. We have to move, now." The rebels scrambled to pack supplies and load the horses. Rosie and Pete clung to each other, their wide eyes reflecting the rising fear around them. John knelt down, touching Rosie's shoulder gently. "Stay close to Ahyona," he told them. "She'll keep you safe." Ahyona crouched beside the children, speaking softly in her melodic Apache tongue. Rosie's trembling slowed as Ahyona tied the green amulet around the girl's neck, murmuring what sounded like a blessing. Pete watched her closely, his small hand gripping hers like a lifeline. Esperanza caught John's arm. "We can't outrun a Federale column with 2 kids and a half-healed woman. Leave them behind and we might have a chance." John's eyes burned into hers. "No, we're not leaving anyone. Not again." His voice was steel, and Esperanza knew better than to argue further. They rode hard through the winding canyons, the sound of distant hoofbeats growing louder behind them. Ahyona took the lead, her movements sure and sharp. She rode like someone born to the desert, scanning the ground and the ridges above with quick, practiced glances. "Left!" she called, pointing toward a narrow gap between 2 towering walls of rock. John and the others followed without question. The passage was so tight they had to dismount and lead the horses single file, the walls pressing close like the throat of the earth. Behind them, the echo of the pursuers grew clearer. Shots rang out, warning shots, testing the distance. Dusty snorted and tossed his head nervously. "Keep moving," John called. "Don't stop." Ahyona paused at a fork in the path, scanning the ground. She crouched low, touching the earth, feeling the faint indentations left by coyotes and deer. She nodded, choosing a trail that wound sharply uphill toward the ridge. By the time the sun started to sink, the rebels had put distance between themselves and the Federal column. They stopped briefly in a sheltered hollow to catch their breath. John dismounted, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked at Ahyona, who stood tall despite her exhaustion. Her presence felt like the only compass they had left in this hostile land. "You saved us today," he said quietly. Ahyona looked at him, her dark eyes calm. "Not yet," she replied. "Storms still coming." By late afternoon, the sun had turned the desert into a burning crucible. John and the rebels reached a high-walled amphitheater of red rock, thinking it might offer a brief refuge. The place was quiet, too quiet. The jagged cliffs around them felt like a trap waiting to spring. Esperanza scanned the ridges with narrowed eyes. "We can't stay here long," she muttered. "This spot screams ambush." Before John could respond, the sound of horses and distant voices carried on the wind. He climbed a boulder and saw the worst. Dust rising from both sides of the canyon. Federales were approaching from the south. To the north, Apache riders were closing in, led by a tall, broad-shouldered warrior with eagle feathers in his hair. Ahyona's face tightened when she saw him. "Cochise," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. The rebels braced themselves, forming a rough semicircle with rifles ready. "We're boxed in," John said grimly. Bullets cracked against the rocks as the Federales opened fire. The rebels returned shots, crouched low behind scattered boulders. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the hot, dry wind. Through the chaos, Cochise advanced from the north, dismounting with a war cry that echoed across the amphitheater. He moved like a predator, his tomahawk gleaming in the sun. Ahyona stepped forward before John could stop her. Her voice rose, fierce and sharp, shouting words in Apache that John couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. She was challenging him. Cochise's eyes burned as he roared something back, pointing his tomahawk at her. The 2 siblings walked toward each other, closing the distance between life and death. "Don't do this!" John shouted, but Ahyona didn't turn. She moved with the resolve of someone who knew there was no other way. The fight between brother and sister was brutal and fast. Cochise swung with deadly strength, but Ahyona ducked, rolled, and countered with the precision of someone who had trained for survival all her life. Blood streaked her arm where his blade grazed her, but she didn't falter. Then, in a single moment, the tide shifted. Cochise lunged forward, and Ahyona sidestepped, driving her knife deep into his chest. His breath caught, his eyes widening in disbelief. She held him for a heartbeat, whispering something in their native tongue, a prayer or a farewell, before he collapsed onto the red dust. The battle wasn't over. Federales were closing in, their shouts growing louder. The rebels were running low on ammo. John fired until his rifle clicked empty, sweat and dust streaking his face. Esperanza cursed under her breath, her last few bullets taking down 2 soldiers. Then, like thunder rolling across the desert, came the sound of more horses, dozens of them. A trumpet call rang out from the southern ridge. John turned and couldn't believe his eyes. A column of riders swept down the canyon, their sombreros tilted low, rifles blazing. At the head was a man with a commanding presence, his black mustache shining in the sun. Pancho Villa himself. "Arriba, muchachos!" Villa bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of battle. His cavalry crashed into the Federales like a hammer through glass, scattering them in all directions. Within minutes, the gunfire dwindled. Federales fled or lay dead in the dust. The few remaining Apache warriors retreated, carrying Cochise's body with solemn silence. John stood breathing hard, staring at the battlefield. Villa dismounted and walked toward him, his dark eyes scanning the scene. He stopped when he saw Ahyona, her knife still in her hand, her face streaked with blood and tears. "You've got more fight than half my men," Villa said with a faint smile. "Ride with us, Apache sister. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey." The red dust of the battlefield had barely settled when Pancho Villa dismounted from his black stallion. His men fanned out across the canyon, gathering rifles and tending to the wounded. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of blood. John stood near the fire-scorched rocks, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching as Ahyona wiped blood from her blade. She looked exhausted but unbroken, her dark eyes calm despite everything they had just survived. Rosie and Pete clung to her, hiding behind her skirts as though she were the only safe place left in the world. Villa approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man who carried storms in his gaze, sharp, assessing, but not unkind. His eyes swept over the small group before landing on Ahyona. "That woman," Villa said, nodding toward her, "is worth 10 soldiers, maybe more." John straightened instinctively. "She's saved our lives more than once, me general. She's no ordinary woman." Villa smirked faintly, then looked back at Ahyona. "Do you understand me, Apache?" Ahyona lifted her chin. "Yes, I understand." Her accent was heavy, but her tone steady. Villa's expression softened, just enough to reveal respect. "Then hear me well. The Federales will hunt you to the ends of the earth if they learn what you can do. Your knowledge of the desert, your courage, it makes you dangerous to them, and valuable to us." Ahyona didn't reply, but she placed a protective hand on Rosie's head. Villa noticed the gesture and gave a small nod of approval. He turned to John. "You and your people are now part of my division. I don't offer this lightly. I need fighters who have something worth dying for, and I can see you do." John glanced at Ahyona and the children. He realized Villa was right. For the first time since Elena's death, he did have something worth fighting for again. Villa leaned closer to John, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Protect her. She's more than just a tracker. She's a symbol of survival, and the Federales will want to break her spirit. Don't let 'em." John nodded, his jaw set. "I won't." Villa straightened, a shadow of a grin crossing his face. Good. Then saddle up, Herrera. War waits for no man. The camp at Santa Rosa Canyon buzzed with new energy. Villa's forces had gathered from across the desert. Men sharpening knives, women loading bandoliers, horses stamping and snorting as the smell of fresh gun oil hung in the air. Among the new arrivals was General Martin Lopez, Villa's youngest commander. He was known for his sharp tactics and sharper tongue. His dark eyes lingered on Ahyona as she taught Rosie and Pete how to weave small rabbit snares from thin strips of leather. "That's the Apache woman?" Lopez asked John with a skeptical grin. "Villa speaks of her like she's some kind of legend." "She's earned every word," John replied evenly. Lopez wasn't convinced. "I don't trust words, Herrera. I trust proof. Let's see what she can do." The next morning, Lopez approached Ahyona with a challenge. "I hear you can track anyone, anywhere. Is that true?" Ahyona met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said simply. "Good," Lopez said, handing her a canteen and a hunting knife. "There's a federal patrol missing near the Conchos River. 6 men, mounted, carrying rifles. Find them. Bring me something to prove they're not just a ghost story." John stepped forward immediately. "She's not going out there alone." Lopez held up a hand. "This is her trial, Herrera. If she's as good as Villa says, she doesn't need anyone holding her hand." Ahyona looked at John and gave a small shake of her head. "I go," she said quietly, "alone." John's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of her venturing out with federales crawling all over the desert. But he saw the fire in her eyes, a determination born from years of surviving when the world wanted her dead. Before she left, Ahyona knelt beside Rosie and Pete. She pressed the green amulet into Rosie's small hand. "Keep this safe," she said softly. "I return." The children clung to her, and for a moment John thought he saw a flicker of fear in Ahyona's face. But then she straightened, adjusted her knife, and walked into the desert with silent steps, leaving no trail behind her. As the sun dipped lower, John sat by the fire, restless. Esperanza teased him. "She's tougher than you think. Stop pacing like a worried husband." John didn't answer. He only stared toward the dark horizon, praying she'd come back. The campfires had burned low when movement stirred at the canyon's edge. A shadow emerged from the darkness, walking with a calm, steady pace. It was Ahyona. Behind her, 6 federal soldiers trudged with their hands bound, their rifles slung over her shoulder like trophies. The camp erupted with shouts of disbelief and cheers. Even Lopez, the ever-skeptical general, stepped forward with raised eyebrows. "You took them alive? Alone?" Ahyona only nodded. "They sleep too heavy," she said simply, tossing the rifles onto the sand. Her face was smeared with dust, but her eyes were sharp, unshaken. Villa laughed, clapping his hands. "Well, General Lopez, you wanted proof? Here it is." Lopez couldn't hide a grin. "Damn, Herrera, she's better than half the scouts I've ever seen." John's chest loosened with relief. As the others gathered around to hear how she did it, he stayed back, watching her from the shadows. When the excitement died down, he found her near the fire, cleaning her knife. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him. "I am fine. They, not so smart." There was a trace of humor in her voice, the barest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. John chuckled softly. "I never doubted you, but I worried, Ahyona. I didn't want to see you go out there alone." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why?" He hesitated. For years he had buried the parts of himself that cared too deeply. But now, under the starlit desert sky, the truth slipped out. "Because I've already lost too much. Elena, my children, the war took them. And when I saw you buried in the sand, I saw the same kind of pain I carry. I couldn't just let it happen again." Ayana's dark eyes softened. "I know pain," she whispered. "It makes heart hard. But you gave me family. Rosie, Pete, and you." John swallowed hard. "Family?" She nodded, touching her chest gently. "Heart family," she said. "Not blood. Stronger." The words struck him deeper than any bullet ever could. He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across her face. Then, without speaking, he handed her his own tin cup of coffee. She took it, their fingers brushing, and for the first time John felt something warm and alive stir in his soul, a fragile hope. In the days that followed, Ayana's presence began to change the camp. She was no longer just the silent survivor John had dug out of the sand. She became a quiet pillar, teaching, protecting, and caring in ways that softened even the hardest souls around the fire. Each morning, Rosie and Pete ran to her side as soon as they woke. She taught them how to read the signs of the desert, the bend of dry grass, the faint trace of animal prints in the sand. She showed Rosie how to weave strong cords from plant fibers, and she taught Pete how to set small snares, his tiny hands fumbling but eager to learn. John watched from a distance one afternoon as Ahyona knelt in the sand with the children. She traced a shape with her finger, a circle with a cross in the center. "Sun," she said in her careful English. "Sun warms, sun gives life." She placed a hand over her heart, then pointed to the sky. God above, nature and God, together. Pete looked up at her curiously. "Like prayer?" he asked. Ahyona smiled softly. "Yes, prayer." Then she closed her eyes and whispered a few words in Apache, a simple melody that carried a peace John hadn't felt in years. That night, as the camp gathered around the fire, Ahyona sat with Rosie and braided her hair, weaving tiny beads she had polished from stones into each braid. The little girl beamed, hugging Ahyona tightly. "You're like a mama," Rosie said, her voice small but filled with affection. Ahyona froze for just a moment, her breath catching, and John saw the emotion flash in her eyes. Slowly, she placed a hand over Rosie's head and whispered, "Thank you." Esperanza, who had once been Ayana's harshest critic, caught the moment too. She sat down nearby, her rifle across her knees. "The kids trust you," Esperanza said. "That says more than anything I could ever argue with." John nodded, meeting Esperanza's gaze. "She's not just surviving anymore. She's giving them something we all forgot to have: hope." Later that evening, when the children were asleep, John approached Ahyona as she stirred a small pot of coffee over the fire. "Rosie's right," he said softly. "You've become the heart of this camp." Ahyona glanced at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Heart?" she repeated quietly, touching her chest. Then she added, "We all need heart, or we are just shadows." John didn't reply, but he felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. The warning came just before dawn. A scout rode in, his face pale beneath a layer of dust. "Federales," he gasped. "2 columns, heavy rifles, they're coming straight for us." The camp erupted into motion. Men grabbed rifles and checked their ammunition. Women gathered water skins and supplies. The children huddled near the fire, wide-eyed. John's jaw tightened as he scanned the horizon. "They found us faster than I expected," he muttered to Esperanza. Esperanza's green eyes narrowed. "Someone's feeding them our trail, or they've brought better trackers." Ahyona stepped forward. "They follow like coyotes," she said, her voice steady. "But I know how to hide scent, how to lead them wrong way." Villa, already saddling his horse, turned to her. "Show us what you can do, Apache sister." With swift, deliberate movements, Ahyona gathered dry branches and scattered them along false trails. She led a group of scouts up a narrow ridge, showing them how to brush away footprints with mesquite branches. She worked silently, her mind sharp as a blade. every motion rooted in generations of survival knowledge. By midday, the federales were close enough that the rumble of their horses shook the canyon floor. "We'll have to hit them before they hit us," Villa growled. "We can't sit and wait." John and Esperanza joined Ahyona on a rocky overlook. Below, the dust cloud of the enemy moved like a storm. Ahyona crouched, scanning the landscape, then pointed to a dry arroyo snaking between two ridges. "Here," she said, "we trap them here. One side shoots, other side blocks." Villa looked at John and grinned. "She's got the mind of a general. Make it happen." As night fell, the rebels lay in wait. The federales entered the trap at dawn, their columns stretched thin along the arroyo. At Ahyona's signal, a shrill whistle, the canyon exploded with rifle fire. Dynamite roared, sending rock and dust cascading onto the soldiers below. John fired shot after shot, his Winchester steady. Beside him, Esperanza barked orders, her voice fierce. Ahyona stayed low, guiding Rosie and Pete to a hidden crevice, whispering soft words to calm their fear. The fight was brutal, but the rebels held their ground. By the time the smoke cleared, the federales were retreating, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Villa rode past, his mustache streaked with dust and sweat. "That Apache saved our skins," he declared. "We'd be dead without her." John glanced at Ahyona, who stood on the ridge, her hair wild in the morning wind. She met his gaze, and for a moment neither of them needed words. That night, after the battle's dust had settled and the camp had gone quiet, John walked to the edge of the ridge. The desert stretched endlessly under a blanket of stars, the sky so clear it felt like heaven itself was watching. Ahyona was already there, sitting on a smooth rock with her knees drawn to her chest. The green stone amulet rested in her hand, glinting faintly in the starlight. Rosie and Pete were asleep by the fire, their breathing soft and even. John approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Ahyona didn't look up at first. "Desert always talks at night," she murmured. "Too many voices in the wind." He sat down beside her, leaving just enough space for comfort. For a long moment, they watched the stars in silence. John felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Ahyona's presence steadied him, like a reminder that life could still have meaning beyond war and grief. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "When this war ends, I don't want to just keep surviving." Ahyona turned her head slightly, listening. "I want more," John continued. "A home, a place where we can breathe, where Rosie and Pete can grow up without hearing gunfire every night. I want a life, with you if you'll have me." Ahyona's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such honesty. She turned the amulet in her hand, then placed it gently in his palm. "My heart," she said softly, "is no longer Apache. It's ours now, yours, mine, the children's, family." John swallowed hard. "Family," he echoed, his voice almost breaking. "I thought I'd lost that forever." She gave him a small, genuine smile, the kind that lit her whole face, rare but powerful. "No, you found it again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind swept gently across the ridge, carrying the faint scent of mesquite. John reached out and took her hand, rough and scarred from years of survival. She didn't pull away. Under the wide desert sky, two people who had been broken by war and loss found something new, a quiet promise of love, of hope, of tomorrow. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The morning after the battle was quiet. Smoke curled from the blackened rocks where gunfire had torn through the canyon hours before. John walked among the horses, checking their saddles, while the rebels packed supplies.
The air was heavy with the scent of dust, leather, and victory, but also with the unspoken knowledge that another fight would always be waiting just beyond the horizon. Pancho Villa called the camp together before sunrise. His voice was firm, but it carried a note of respect. "We ride to Santa Rosa Canyon. We'll regroup there, stock supplies, and wait for new orders.
The Federales will not give us peace, but they'll find us ready." John stood with Ahyona, Rosie, and Pete listening in silence. The children clutched the edges of her tattered shawl like ducklings behind their mother. Villa's gaze fell on Ahyona. "You, Apache sister, will guide us. No man knows this desert like you do. Find us water, find us safety." Ahyona nodded, her dark eyes calm. "I will," she said simply. The column of riders set out across the desert as the sun rose, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. John rode beside Ahyona. The children nestled safely between them on Dusty's broad back. Every few miles she would dismount, crouch low, and study the ground, reading tracks, scanning for hidden springs. By midday, she led them to a narrow gully, where water seeped from the rocks, forming a small pool no bigger than a saddle blanket. She filled canteens and let Rosie and Pete splash their hands in the cool water. "This place," she said softly, "is life in the desert. We must thank it." She closed her eyes for a moment, murmuring words in Apache that sounded like a prayer. John knelt beside her, watching her hands. "I don't know your language," he said quietly, "but I know what you're saying. Thanking God, aren't you?" Ahyona's lips curved in a faint smile. "Always," she replied. As the day wore on, the rebels began to follow her lead without question. She found paths through the red cliffs that no one else could see, shortcuts hidden between narrow walls of stone. At night, when the campfires burned low, she taught Rosie and Pete how to listen to the desert's whispers, the rustle of dry wind through the brush, the howl of distant coyotes. Esperanza, who once doubted her, now sat with Ahyona by the fire, sharing strong coffee and quiet stories. "You've got grit, Apache," Esperanza said one evening, "more than most of us." Ahyona only smiled, braiding Rosie's hair with small polished beads she had carried since before her exile. John watched these moments with a strange warmth in his chest. For years he had lived like a ghost, haunted, silent, waiting for nothing but the end. But here, amid the harsh desert and the endless war, something was changing. He looked at Ahyona and the children and thought, maybe this is what God meant when He promised second chances. The journey to Santa Rosa Canyon took 3 hard days of riding. By the time they arrived, the sky was streaked with copper and violet, the desert stretching endless and silent under the falling sun. Villa's men began to set up camp, their laughter and chatter echoing against the red canyon walls. John, however, led Ahyona, Rosie, and Pete to a ridge above the camp. From there, the view stretched for miles, a sea of dunes and scattered mesquite trees, glowing under the last light of day. He sat down on a smooth boulder, the children curling up beside him. Ahyona stood, with her shawl fluttering in the evening breeze, her dark hair shining in the sunset. For a long moment they said nothing. The silence of the desert wasn't empty. It was full of memory, loss, and a strange kind of grace. John reached for his Bible, worn and weathered from years of sorrow. He opened to a page where Elena's handwriting still lingered. "God forgives those who dare to love." He sat down, low and steady, like a man talking to both himself and the world beyond the horizon. "The desert takes, but it also gives. Out here, I found more than survival. I found faith. I found family. And maybe, just maybe, I found a reason to keep living."
Ahyona knelt beside Rosie and Pete, holding their small hands. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we teach them more. How to track, how to pray, how to live free." John looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, the shadows in his heart eased. "We'll give them a home," he said, "not just a camp, but a place where they can grow without fear, a place where the scars of the past don't own us anymore." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the four of them stood together, no longer strangers, but a family forged by hardship, courage, and faith. Out here in the true Wild West stories, legends aren't born from gold or glory. They're born from grit, love, and the kind of faith that refuses to die. This land may test every bone in your body, but it also teaches you what truly matters. And for me, that's this family. That's this moment. The screen fades to black as the sound of the desert wind lingers, a soft, haunting reminder of a world where every sunset holds a promise. If you believe in true Wild West stories of courage, redemption, and faith, join us for more tales like this. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and saddle up for the next ride.